How a Romance Novel Saved the Galaxy by Ariana de Ralte. Chapter 82, John Antilles 6. John was feeling pretty accomplished at this fake dating thing. Sure, their second date attempt visiting the food market on Otor's hub had also been a disaster since John was accosted by one of his old bounty hunter rivals, and the whole thing had dissolved into a battle of John plus any Mandalorians nearby versus his rival's gang. They'd been kicked off the hub then, but Osan's family didn't seem to care since they'd gotten their shopping done. After that, both he and Osan had agreed that trying to eat in public didn't seem to be working, so they should try some other forms of public dating. John had had no idea what other types of dates there were, considering the romance novel he'd read involved being on the run across the desert, and he didn't know of any hot springs in this sector off the top of his head. However, he'd asked the Force, and it had sent them to this planet. Karguna was a planet made up of a series of islands scattered across a vast ocean. The sun was setting a golden-orange color, tinting the waves a dark purple where the sun didn't hit them. A boardwalk crawled over the entire island they were on, with restaurants, massage parlors, and other entertainment places looking out over the beaches. John figured that the beach counted as a desert of some sort, what with the sand, and the boardwalks left them with plenty of witnesses to their debate. "Are you sure they won't hurt us?" asked Osan. He was crowding close to John on the rock they were perched on. John had had to lift them up there once the migration had started. The camehorns were much faster than he'd expected. Every piece of sand on the beach was covered in lumbering creatures using their sharp black horns and flippers to bury their eggs. The camehorns looked like a cross between a hairless mudhorn and a black beetle with at least 6 flippers. There were some tourists watching in horrified fascination from the boardwalk, but the chill in the air meant it was the off-season on Karguna's beaches. "Only if we get in the way of their egg-laying," said John. "It's more likely we will be defending them at some point tonight. The horns of a mature adult sell for a lot of credits." "So that is why the Force sent you here?" asked Osan. "One moment," John said, then leaped half-floating to get across the beach and to the boardwalk. One of the tourists had an add-on to their holocam, which was about to fire an electro dart into the crowd of camehorns. John crushed the top of the hologram. "Why don't you look with your eyes?" he suggested. The Zabrak bared their teeth for a moment, but then saw the crushed electrodart launcher and nodded submissively. John looked around and spotted 2 familiar Rhodians, this time in matching bright neon blue shirts advertising some casino. "Watch them," he ordered. The 2 nodded, looking pleased at the assignment. Even after reading that book, John would never understand Mandalorians. He leapt back to Osan. "Maybe that's the way to get your fan club to calm down," mused Osan, still staring at the Rhodians. "We give them assignments to help on your mission, so they're not just standing around staring at your pretty face." John really couldn't understand why the Mandalorians insisted that his face covered in scars was beautiful. "I don't really know what my missions are until I'm in them. Surely they have better things to do." "If there's anything that carking romance novel has taught me, it's that my people have a hidden romantic side a parsec wide. If they can't date you, fighting for or helping you is the next best thing." "I suppose we could try." John was a bit dubious of the suggestion, but Osan knew his culture best, and it was certainly clear John knew nothing about it at all. All the Mandalorians he'd met while undercover in the Bounty Hunters Guild had been grizzled, taciturn warriors who didn't appreciate anyone interfering in their work. Though, come to think of it, he'd worn a hood with a mask at the time, so they had never even seen his face, same as he'd never seen theirs. It was strange to think that if he'd been barefaced, he might have had a completely different experience. That reminded him of a question he'd been wary to ask while on the ship. "Are all Mandalorian families elite like yours?" "What do you mean?" asked Osan. "I gather it's common for families to be made up of non-related and related members, but you all travel together." Osan nodded. "All right. There's a Mandalorian saying, elite or shala taldin, or family is more than blood. Me and my Vodika are my Burr's genetic children, and my Babadus are adopted. Not that it matters. It's all mixed up like most Mandalorian clans. Our people used to be nomadic, so it actually wasn't unusual for clans to wander the galaxy together in their ships. Nowadays, the bigger clans are usually settled somewhere in the Mandalorian system, but our clan is so small that following the old traditions worked well. What if your little sister doesn't want to be a mercenary for hire? You haven't seen how bloodthirsty she is in battle yet, said Osan with a chuckle. But we'd support her in whatever she wants to do. I certainly left for a few years to get my medical training. The hardest thing was trusting they wouldn't get themselves killed while I was gone. John found it sweet how much he cared for his family, though he found it a little overzealous when Osan turned that attention on him. John couldn't remember the last time he had been so well fed. It was a strange, warm sensation. The sound of the cane horns digging and moving sand filled the silence before Osan spoke. I heard rumors on the Jedi net that Jedi do have clans when they're young. Do you mind telling me what yours was like? John couldn't help tensing at the question through no fault of Osan's own. I didn't really have the traditional temple upbringing, he said. Why not? Something must have shown on his face because Osan immediately said, Wait! Nope, you don't have to answer that. John took the man's hand and squeezed his thanks, still a bit surprised how natural it was to initiate physical contact with someone after all their practice. You should probably know something at least. Your family has told me so many stories about you that it feels unbalanced. Just don't share it with them, said John, casting his gaze pointedly back to the fan club members on the boardwalk. Never, said Osan with a handsome smile. Most Jedi are found when they are children between 1 to 5 years old and brought to the temple only if their parents or guardians give permission. But the galaxy is large and many children aren't found. I certainly wasn't until the Dark Woman stumbled upon me. My parents had died and I was using the Force to survive on the streets, explained John. Years meditating on the Force had helped him think of those memories with peace. So she took you to the temple? Eventually. I was nearly 7 years old and she knew they would say I was too old for Jedi training, so instead she drilled me hard in everything an initiate and Padawan would know, so that when she did bring me to the temple to register me as her Padawan at 10, no questions would be asked about the year she found me. I'd say that was clever, but you don't sound admiring. John shook his head, but couldn't bring himself to elaborate on just how harsh the Dark Woman's training methods were to his 7-year-old self. It left me very disconnected from the main temple and Jedi culture. I think there are many Jedi who mistrust me because of it, and the initiate clans are just as much a mystery to me as they are to you. Osan's hand tightened in his. Also, they always think I'm dead, said John, wanting to change the subjects. Osan choked down a laugh, even though John was sure he'd mentioned this before. Why is that? As far as I can tell, they hear a report of a John Antilles dying, which must happen every single day considering the size of the galaxy and how common my name is, and they decide that whichever John Antilles died was me. I've had my expense account deactivated at least 3 times. Surely they are still getting the reports of your missions. John winced. Osan had a point there. He tried to contact the temple as rarely as possible. I'm not the best at keeping in touch, he admitted, and it was true the Force kept him too busy and often on missions that weren't authorized or even considered missions by the current Jedi Order. Well, that might be why. Osan trailed off, looking at something behind John. John turned as well to see a probe droid with what looked like a bucket held in its extensors. As it got closer, they could hear it warbling a friendly greeting over the sound of the game horns. I sense nothing off in the Force, said John, confused as to why the droid was also ignoring the game horns if the bucket was some sort of attack. When he stretched his senses to the boardwalk and the waving Mandalorian Rodians, he finally figured it out. I think our Rodian friends are giving us a gift. They both watched in bemused silence as the droid hovered over their rock to gently lower the bucket. It beeped a friendly goodbye before zipping back towards the boardwalk. Osan looked at him. I sense no malicious intent, said John. So Osan opened the bucket, revealing a checkered blanket on top. He pulled it out, placing it to the side. A delicious smell filled the area, freshly cooked seafood and some type of bread. Sure enough, Osan pulled out a veritable feast of food, shrimp and crabs being prominent, but also fresh bread, condiments, and at the bottom of the bucket was a little cake. Osan began to laugh. John was a bit distracted by how he threw his head back into it, exposing his throat. They sent us a picnic! Osan howled in between his laughter. They could still have poisoned or drugged it, pointed out John. Osan sobered, but eyed him with a look that made John wary. That look meant that the medic was plotting something. Well, then, with your Jedi power to filter drugs, you'll have to take at least one bite of everything to make sure it's safe for me to eat. John made a face, but relaxed when he realized Osan's intent. On one hand, he found it a little annoying that Osan would always try to feed him, but on the other, the care the other showed for him made him feel warm in a way John hadn't experienced in a long time. He really should meditate on the sensation. Until then, he leaned in to take the shrimp Osan was holding towards him. It was his duty as a good fake boyfriend to make sure his boyfriend could eat as well. So, fake dating, huh? Osan choked on his water, but had the presence of mind to make sure he swallowed before he coughed it all over the ship's controls. Dude, what are you talking about? He said once the coughing stopped. Well, other than the fact that you occasionally start to say the word fake in front of boyfriend, then stop yourself. You forget about the emergency cockpit recorder. Well, I'll think. It was Babadook's job to maintain that particular system, which recorded everything that happened in case of a crash. He didn't look at it that often, so he must have found out recently, but still. John was out of the ship. He'd said the Force told him he needed to go alone into the dense jungle of the planet they were on. Osan had wanted to go with him, since the Jedi was always getting in trouble, but he respected the man's wishes. He did give him a comm and got a promise out of John to call if he got in any trouble. Osan figured it was 50-50 if the Jedi would do so, but that would be the case for any Mandalorian Osan was dating as well. Their cultures really did take stubbornness to the next level. You haven't told anyone, have you, Babadook? Oh, it's way more entertaining for me if I don't, said Babadook, showing his jagged teeth. Han's grin really did look a bit disturbing to most humanoids, but the only thing Osan had to fear was whatever mischief his Babadook was planning with this information. If you don't intend on telling anyone, then why are you bringing it up now? Asked Osan. Babadook leaned against the wall, tilting his head to stare at Osan with his red-ringed eyes. I thought it'd be nice and get things moving for my nephew and his future renewal. Osan snorted in disbelief at the declaration. Annika, what exactly is the difference between what you're doing now and the actual dating? This is only my opinion as a non-romantic or sexual being, but you do all the same things. The difference is that if the fan club hadn't formed, John would just be off doing his Jedi things and not engaging with me or any Mandalorian. The thought made Osan feel a bit depressed. He'd gotten used to John in his life, to feeling a warm hand on his shoulder when he had sunk into a funk. The sheer joy he got out of making sure his Jedi was warm and fed, sharing a smile whenever John's eclectic sense of humor decided to rear its head, or an exasperated look at the antics of his leech, waking up together like it was the most normal thing in the galaxy. Babadook was watching him. Antilles doesn't let any of the rest of us near him, but for you he relaxes. He lets you touch him and even hold your hand. I saw him jump up on the table the other day to avoid you. Osan sighed. And we practiced the touching in private. It took a full week before he would stop flinching. And what about now? In private, with no one to perform for, other than yourselves. Osan thought back to waking up this morning with an arm over his shoulders and John's body pressed against him, despite John starting at his usual only slightly touching position when they went to bed. John had seemed surprised, but not embarrassed when they woke up. He has been more cuddly, said Osan cautiously, unwilling to hope. Right, crowed Babadook, like taming a feral tuca. It's taken him a while to get used to your touch, but now he's eating right out of your hand. Osan gave him a doubtful look. That doesn't seem likely. It was more like John could trust that Osan wasn't going to jump him or break his boundaries. Consider telling him you wanted to be real, Attica. I'd bet you'd find it hardly changes anything about what you're doing. It was more likely John would be disappointed that Osan was just like the others, even though he wasn't. Osan wasn't moving over him, and he'd gotten used to the Jedi's handsomeness, even if it did blindside him every once in a while. And what if he isn't interested or runs like he did from his fan club before? Well, then you'll know. That was hardly reassuring, and Osan had an additional worry that John would agree to stay with him just to avoid his fan club and not because of any actual feelings for Osan. I'll think about it, Babadook. The hot springs were hidden within a canyon that was only visible from the air. They had a long, winding trek through wind-blown canyon walls, which were streaked with reds and yellows. Finally, they came around a twisting turn to see the springs dotting a much wider canyon, the smell of sulfur hanging in the air. Although some of the pools were too hot or acidic to support life, there was enough fresh water in the hot springs oasis that there were several trees crowded around the best water sources. Nared scooped up Kiri so she wouldn't fall in by accident, while they looked for the best source of water and where they could rest tonight. There were still a few hours until the sundown. Nared turned to ask Hyam if he liked the spot where they were standing and choked on the words. Hyam had his boots, robe, and belt off, and was casually stripping off every inch of clothing underneath.